Hey guys, welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. I'm Arcran, and today we're talking about how you can better use languages in your 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons game. Almost every single player character speaks something other than common, but typically I don't see languages coming up in campaigns outside of small, niche things. We're going to talk about the do's and don'ts on implementing more language uses in your campaign, as well as how to make your players feel like their choices in language actually matter. Now, the easiest way to make languages more relevant in your game is to just have NPCs that don't speak common. While your entire party has to speak common just to have a cohesive game and so that they communicate with each other, NPCs don't have to follow this rule. While this is the easiest option, it has some pretty big drawbacks to it. In general, only one or two of your players are going to speak the same non-common language. This means that if you have an extended conversation with an NPC that doesn't speak common, most of your party is going to have a hard time contributing. So while this does provide a benefit to a couple players, it kind of does it at the expense of the rest of the party, which is not something we really want to do. Because of this, you want to make sure that NPCs that don't speak common are generally going to have a short conversation with the party, just so you're not blocking players from playing the game for an extended period. With this in mind, let's look at some options that reward players for their language choices without penalizing the other players. The first set of ideas are all built around the concept that for a lot of NPCs, Common is probably not their first language. An elf probably learns Elvish before they learn Common, and they're probably more comfortable speaking it. In general, I would make NPCs be a bit more open and friendly when speaking their primary language. This could take the form of an Elvish guard being a bit easier to persuade if the party speaks Elvish, or a Dwarvish smith giving the party a small discount if someone's able to speak in Dwarvish with them. This is a small benefit that isn't a huge boon, but it makes the players feel like their choice in language actually mattered without excluding the rest of the party. Depending on the NPC and the player in question, you might grant the party an even bigger benefit. For example, the Halfling language is supposed to be exceptionally rare outside of the actual Halfling race. So if one of your players speaks that, you might want to give them a substantial bonus when they're talking with a Halfling. On the complete other hand, some languages like Infernal, Abyssal, or Deep Speech should be kind of terrifying to hear, and you might want to give your player a bonus to Intimidation if they're doing, ominous chanting in that language or something like that. Another thing to keep in mind is that in combat, a lot of NPCs would try to speak a language other than Common if that's an option to them. That way their commands and such aren't overheard by the enemy and they can still communicate really well. Use this in your game. If the goblins are just speaking in Goblin and the party doesn't understand it, makes the fight feel a bit more alive, and it makes it a bit more clear that they're fighting something intelligent. If someone in the party does speak Goblin, then they get to overhear the Goblin's tactics and plans, and that can be a really great benefit for them in combat. Maybe they hear about the secret squad of archers that's sneaking around to try to shoot them from the side, and they can react accordingly. The last thing to keep in mind with the fact that some NPCs will not have Common as their primary language is that a lot of books and things like that, especially journals and diaries, are going to be written in something other than Common. This is a really good way to include other languages, because if the party either speaks the language or has the magic to comprehend it, they just get the information. If they don't, they can still get the information, they're just going to have to jump through some hoops like getting a translator or something like that. It doesn't block the information, it just makes it a lot more difficult to obtain. You can also use this principle in dungeons to give your players a bit more information and make your dungeons a bit more interesting. After all, a lot of dungeons were built a very long time ago, so most of the writing in them is probably not in Common. You can use this as a great way to either lore dump about the dungeon, give your players a little bit of extra knowledge about what to expect, or just give them some interesting flavor text to read as they go. Another thing to keep in mind here is that the languages the party speaks is an excellent way to prompt your players for a bit more backstory information. Why does your human fighter know Dwarvish? When did that wizard pick up Infernal? It can be a really good way to make them flesh out their backstory just a little bit more and in an interesting way. The next principle is going to make your world feel a bit more alive and also give your players more ways to use their language proficiencies. In the real world, we see a lot of terms from other languages show up in scientific and artistic fields. In biology, you get a lot of Greek and Latin, and cooking and music are kind of just a mess of all sorts of different languages. Maybe in your campaign, Elvish is the language used for a lot of musical terms, and the Dwarvish script is used for a lot of more advanced math. By adding uses for languages that extend beyond direct communication, you have more ways that it can show up in your campaign, and you also give your players more reasons why they might speak a language. Maybe the bard learned Elvish because a lot of the great love ballads were written in Elvish. You also might want to associate specific languages with just general fields. Maybe all wizards speak Draconic in your setting, and that means that a lot of the books and such about magic are going to be written in Draconic. It can be a great way to take some of the lesser used languages like Celestial or Infernal and give them a real practical use in your campaign so the players that picked them have a way to use those abilities. The last general principle is that in the process of learning a language, it's very likely that a character would also learn a lot about that race and that culture. A character that speaks Elvish can generally be expected to know more about elves than a character that doesn't. A character that speaks another race's language might just know things about that race by default, like their lifespan or general cultural traditions. For more advanced knowledge, maybe you give them an advantage on their history checks to reflect the fact that they know a bit more about that race than the average person. If used properly, you can use this to feed your players information that they're going to trust a lot more than normal, because in general, if players only know something because of one of their abilities or choices, they trust it more. Maybe in a murder mystery you're able to rule out one of the suspects because it would go strongly against that race's culture, and the player that speaks that race's language just knows that. When you're planning out an area, try to think of things that your players might know by default just because of the languages they chose. The easiest way to do this is just to have landmarks and areas that have very literal names. This will both give you a cool name and let your players know what to expect. Naming something the Spider Forest doesn't sound very interesting, but if you name it the Spider Forest but in Orcish, a player that speaks Orcish gets to know a little bit more information, and you get a really fun name. If you put something like a riddle or a puzzle in front of your party, maybe speaking a specific language will simplify it. There's a metaphor that only makes sense in Gnomish or something like that if the party knows Gnomish, they can cut out a whole chunk of the process. And with that, we're done. You now have some general principles that'll make it easier for you to integrate language into your game without excluding party members, as well as flesh out your world a bit more and make it feel a little bit more alive. If you have other ways you've seen languages used in games that are interesting, or you just have a suggestion on what I should cover next, please leave a comment. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum, and have a good day.